Hello, my name is Alan Ahn, Director of Programs and Communications for the Global America Business Institute, or GABI. Thank you for listening to this podcast hosted by GABI. First of all, hope everyone who is listening is safe and well. Today we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Robert Ichord. He is a Senior Fellow at Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, as well as an independent consultant on energy issues. Dr. Ichord has over 40 years of federal government service working on international energy policy and environmental issues in various agencies and departments, including Department of Energy and USAID. Most recently, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation within the Energy Resources Bureau at State Department, a post he retired from in 2016. Dr. Ichord, a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today. As I've already briefly laid out, you've had an illustrious career working in energy policy issues in government, and that's likely an understatement. Looking back, which accomplishment do you look upon most fondly, and which do you think will have the most lasting impact going forward?
Thank you very much, Alan. It's a pleasure to be with you here virtually today for this podcast, and hope you're well. Over the 40 years, there are a lot of things that I look fondly on, so it's hard to pick one accomplishment or area that I think is the most significant, but because it goes way back to the days of the oil embargo in the late 70s to all the changes in international politics and in Europe, et cetera, through these years. But I think that one of the most rewarding challenges and opportunities that I had the pleasure of pursuing was as the point person in USAID for U.S. energy assistance to Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union after the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89. And obviously these were extremely, important, groundbreaking historical time. And so being able to have the resources to really work with these new independent countries was tremendous. And I think we were successful in catalyzing the restructuring reform of the energy sector, particularly the power sector, in most of these countries, and helping to develop really from scratch sort of a more market-oriented systems, professional energy regulatory authorities. We work regionally to promote cooperation among the countries, and we established with NERUC an association of energy regulators in Europe that continues to operate today. So, in terms of specific things, I often say that that one of the greatest individual things was working on the team that closed the remaining reactors at Chernobyl. And that was a big effort, multi-billion-dollar effort that eventually succeeded in building a safe containment over the destroyed reactor. But also, I think the work that we did in the Balkans after the brutal wars in that region, in terms of working with the European Commission and the donors to develop the Energy Community Treaty in the Balkans, which was the first multilateral treaty after the war, where energy obviously was very important. And to some extent, the energy community was modeled on the coal and steel community that was a predecessor to the European Union. So I think this contributed to stabilizing this volatile region. So I'll stop there because I could go on for a long time.
Well, you mentioned the power sector reform, transformation in the developing world, and this is an area that you've worked directly in. You've written on and researched on the need of, basically developing countries to institute sound legal and regulatory frameworks. With nuclear power specifically, that becomes even more imperative, given the challenges with building the necessary nuclear safety, security, regulatory institutions. for any country. What is your objective or dispassionate assessment of nuclear's potential contribution to clean energy in the developing world?
Well, thanks a lot for that's an important question. As we consider the urgency of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and the critical role that developing countries play in the global energy and electricity market, those countries are up to 60% of global primary energy supply, at least the non-OECD countries, which you can debate as to whether they're developing countries or not, and electrification is growing, and the demand is growing in those regions, unlike in the industrial world. So the U.S., Europe, Japan, all seeing, except for blips in 2 years ago, declining electricity consumption. And certainly with the COVID situation and the worldwide demand for electricity is falling. But, but after the pandemic, obviously we can, I think, expect increasing electricity demand with urbanization, population growth. And so the choices that countries make with regards to their future investments in the electric sector are really important. And one of my concerns is how will the financial position that these countries will be facing after this traumatic economic shock affect these decisions. But there's no question that the legal and regulatory framework on the nuclear side, as well as on the economic energy regulatory side, is vital to having viable electricity sectors and to attracting investment. If you look at what's happening in developed worlds to date from the standpoint of nuclear, it's been mainly the large plants built in the more advanced developing countries, the India's, Mexico's, Argentina, Brazil, Latin America, and South Africa, for instance, are the main ones that come to mind. And if we look at developing countries around the world, while their electricity systems have grown, 1,000 megawatt units are big, and they're also costly, right?
Yeah.
And so this factor, as well as the safety issues after Fukushima, and the issues related to the cost and the fit of these systems, I think caused some countries to turn away from nuclear options. And of course, we've seen the tremendous fall in prices for wind and solar and in the developing countries. And I heard the head of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, just last week or so, and John Morton from the Atlantic Council interviewed him. He was saying that 75% of new capacity last year was in renewables, which is, we always talked about 50% maybe over the last couple of years, but he was saying 75%. So, but nevertheless, some developing countries, are deciding to build large new reactors. In large part, and we probably get to this later, it's financed by state financing from Russia and China. I've been working on Bangladesh and Pakistan, have 2 new papers out on those countries, which are building new reactors with China's and Russia support. India, of course, long-standing producer, but nuclear generator, and they're building new reactors. Egypt, of course, in terms of the Russian big project in Egypt to build 4 reactors. And in Africa, you're seeing increasing interest too. Not quite as far along in terms of Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, some of the larger, more advanced countries. But clearly the regulatory issues are critical. And while IAEA and others are working with some of these countries, more needs to be done. I think it's very interesting to look at the UAE experience in this regards, because obviously there's been a huge effort put into developing high quality regulatory and safety culture capacity for the 4 Korean supplied reactors there, and extensive transparent international cooperation, with not only IAEA, but with WANO and many other organizations. So I think that this is really the model that really should be looked at by developing countries that are interested in nuclear. And, we should try to support it, because obviously the issue is there's a lot of concern that with the Russian and Chinese involvement, that they're not going to have adequate safety standards.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, last but not least, I think, and where I'm sort of betting that there will be a much greater role for nuclear across the developing world, is for the SMRs, the small modular reactors. It's, they're still at the development and demonstration stage, and probably, I've always said if we can get the initial demonstrations in the U.S. done in the mid decade, and we could hopefully shoot, as we suggested in our Atlantic Council task force, for an international deployment by 2030. That may be a little ambitious, but certainly some of the companies are talking to developing countries as well as others about the potential for SMRs, and there seems to be substantial interest, but still a lot of not so much understanding as to what are all the implications of developing these smaller reactors. And there's a lot of not only economic but safety, proliferation, financing issues that will need to be addressed in terms of broader scale deployment. But I think that certainly it is highly promising in terms of the restoration of U.S. role in this area, because I think U.S. involvement in the large reactors is pretty difficult, although Westinghouse is still, GE are still pursuing some opportunity.
The State Department relatively recently it started the concept of the Nuclear Cooperation MOU, NCMOU, at least in part to get a head start on engaging with developing countries on fostering the necessary civil, nuclear, legal, and regulatory environments. What other means and policy options are available to accomplishing this broader objective? Not only with respect to large reactor programs, but especially by the time that SMRs and advanced reactors become available, as you say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think obviously from the standpoint of U.S. policy and higher priority for this area, this is an important question, because it is an international business, and obviously the market potential, as we discussed, is probably larger in these developing countries that people say will account for 90% of future electricity growth. So, obviously you got to look at what is the option, what are the possibilities of trying to develop the kinds of engagements that will allow us to really be at the forefront of SMR development in these regions. And I think, so I don't have any objection with the MOU approach, but I think that it needs a broader context and some beef to it, rather than just doing MOUs. And that tends to be the problem in a lot of areas, but particularly in this one, is that we have the ambition to try to establish these relationships, and but on the other hand, there's very few resources to really back it up. And clearly it becomes really important in terms of dealing with the strong diplomatic and marketing efforts of Russia and China to work with developing countries. Vladimir Putin is amazing, because he convenes all these people, he pursues these countries, even if they're early stages of development. And I don't know if you noticed that last year the Russians brought all the senior African energy leaders to Sochi for a big conference they were having there, and there were Russ Adam and others were giving presentations about how, touting the Russian technical abilities to promote nuclear power. So, I mean, those kinds of things show that you've got to have high level support for this process. And I think the two issues that I would raise here. One is that nuclear energy needs to be more effectively integrated into our USG overall energy and commercial policy efforts. My perception, and perhaps it's wrong, is that nuclear has been sort of a preserve of its own. I think it derives very much from the strong non-proliferation, which is a critical issue. But it's not been well integrated for the most part into foreign energy policies. That's not to say that there aren't strong efforts by state and commerce and DOE and others to push US interest in key countries like India, for instance. You've seen that over time, right? But I still think that we have lots of mechanisms, and this is from my experience with state as well as with aid. We have lots of mechanisms where we have a comprehensive economic and energy dialogue with countries. All kinds of countries, from the Moroccos to the Brazils. And so I think what, as developing countries look at their options, it's important for the US to come to the table with an integrated package that includes nuclear as well as gas, which is a big priority of this administration, as well as renewables and energy efficiency, et cetera. And so that we have a coordinated policy at a high level to try to respond in a responsive way to the needs that these countries are having. Some cases that will be nuclear, other cases it won't be nuclear, depending on their resources and economics, et cetera. And then I think, as the recent report of the Fuel Working Group suggests, I mean, we need the priority of nuclear in our overall international approach needs to be increased. And resources from the Congress need to be developed that can do this advanced collaborative work. I mean, I was lucky in Eastern Europe because we work with DOE and NRC on supporting the nuclear regulatory and operational side in most of the countries that had, of course, the Soviet design reactors. And so I had millions of dollars that I transferred to DOE and NRC to do cooperative programs. Right now, that money does not exist for our international energy activities. And that's where the government, together with the private sector, could be much more effective and have much more of a long-term perspective. So, let's put it in terms of new atoms for peace type of thing, Something that really had some beef to it, that could establish these relationships and work with them over many years especially to prime the pump, let's say, for SMRs to come, to make sure they understand the full applications, to look at them in terms of the broader electricity system planning, how they fit in the system, where you could site them, all these kinds of things, and whether the grid requirements, et cetera. And so that it goes beyond, it goes beyond just the issue of a nuclear cooperation MOU. If we're going to be effective, because China, China pushes nuclear, but they're pushing everything else. From coal to renewables to grid, everything.
Let me. We'll get back to this topic of a more coordinated, integrated approach involving nuclear in the face of Russian, Chinese competition a bit later. But you mentioned something earlier about some figures that IRENA came out with about most of, the vast majority of new capacity additions now coming from renewables. How do you envision the relationship between nuclear and renewable energy in the developing world? Is this fundamentally a competitive relationship, over developing world clean energy markets, or are these technologies, somehow could they work cooperatively, be integrated to contribute to global climate mitigation as well as addressing developing world energy needs?
That's a good question, Alan. I think I see it varies to some extent from country to country, from region to
Sure.
region. But I think it's both. I think, basically there is both a competitive aspect to it as well as a complementary aspect to the relationship between renewables and nuclear. And a competitive in the sense that capital is limited for new power investments, right? And so, and that, and so when the pie is growing, and clearly there is room for a diversified strategy that includes both. The problem is financing. It's going to come from government, international financial institutions. It's going to come from the private sector. So to some extent, there is this tension to some and how much debt can the country assume in terms of the financing of the power sector growth investments. But clearly nuclear has a lot of advantages if you can afford to build them, in terms of reliable baseload power, renewables, mainly variable and intermittent. So they can be complementary in looking at how do you design your system to be cleaner and more reliable. And that, you've got this issue of in Asia, particularly in substituting for baseload coal, which is and with both the high electricity demand and the greater dependence on coal in that region, the nuclear is a baseload alternative. And some of the countries clearly are seeing it that way, at least a part of diversified strategy that can reduce emissions, reduce coal, or even complement coal in some cases, like we're seeing in Pakistan and Bangladesh. But economics is going to be a key factor here, economics and financing. Because obviously the issues related to can you build these nuclear plants on time and on budget is a big question, even for all of these units. SMRs, I think, add a new dimension to it, because SMRs, you can build several units presumably and at a short period of time, so you don't have this huge interest during construction. Two, that they are more flexible, can follow the loads, and therefore they can serve not only as reliable 24/7 baseload power units and replace coal, but they can and even combined cycles, but they can also be flexible in terms of helping to deal with the intermittency problems of renewables. That's why I've supported really the importance of the RD&D on the SMRs, because they do have, in a sense, a lot of potential applications, and applications that can't be met by batteries, at least at this point. Everybody talks about battery storage, but listen, in a lot of areas, you've got real differences in seasonal requirements. So batteries can't deal with that, at least in an economically viable way. You can deal power with certain daily kinds of shifts, but that's why I think that there's a lot of promise in these smaller reactors that can be built with much less upfront cost, and presumably and hopefully eventually can be financed, including by private sectors. So you're not just dealing with requirements for government funding.
As you stated earlier about Russia being a major competitor, a supplier of civil nuclear technologies, Russia has a fairly robust presence in much of the developing world, not only in terms of energy and nuclear energy, but a broad range of areas, as you've suggested. The Russians clearly have advantages in selling nuclear technology to developing countries, especially considering their business model. What do you see as the critical factors determining whether these countries decide to go with Russia or not?
Well, clearly, I mean, Russia has in its history and with the Soviet Union been very much involved in the Eastern Europe sector. In more recent times, of course, they have focused very much on Middle East and South Asia. So I think, and in many cases, the projects are the result of decades of cooperation and planning for these kinds of efforts. Take Egypt, for example, take India, take, Turkey. Some of these areas where they're doing these projects, they've been involved in trying to do these projects for decades. Mm. So I think this and it's not just the energy relationship. For instance, I was looking at Bangladesh, as I said. I mean, Bangladesh has had a long-standing relationship with regards to the oil industry in Bangladesh. State oil industry, Petrobangla, and it's been very heavily supported by Russian companies over the years, and also military.
Yeah.
So a lot of these the countries I mentioned, particularly Egypt, India, Turkey, big nuclear sales and relationships that exist between these countries, and to some extent that spills over to this cooperation on the nuclear side. So I think that long-standing relationship overall has been a factor in some of these projects. Of course, in Eastern Europe, you have the fact that most of the Hungary, Czechs, the Slovaks, the Bulgarians, all have Russian Soviet design reactors that are in place, and that makes it hard for the West to compete, because the people in those countries have the experience and knowledge of the West of the VVR reactors. And so you're seeing now the plans in Hungary to build the VVR 1200 reactors there to replace the older PAX units, which was done by Orban under a sole source procurement, and there was a lot of debate, a lot of criticism, debate on it, but it seems to be going ahead. So, so what else? Yeah, I mean, but the financing obviously is critical, right? In the sense of the government, Russian government, providing long-term financing. We'll see with the pandemic and the serious impact on the oil price revenues, to what extent they're going to be able to sustain their international nuclear efforts and even complete a lot of the plants that they had already promised. It's going to be an interesting to see how they deal with the demands on the resources in terms of the economic recovery and the role of some of these state companies like Rosatom. The other aspect, which is often discussed, although I'm not sure that it's a deciding factor, has been the fact that not only do they supply the fuel, but they offer to take back the spent fuel. I'm not sure how many instances of that have actually happened. I'm not sure there are many, but anyway, so those are some of the considerations that I think are important, as well as the fact that there is a very substantial linkage in some cases that's developed between the Russian efforts on oil and gas, now with LNG being a major LNG exports from the Arctic, LNG and Sakhalin and other areas. That's becoming an element of overall Russian strategic foreign policy advance. So it's I wouldn't discount that, because obviously Putin sees energy overall as one of the imperative areas of Russian advantage.
A lot of lessons there, perhaps to engage early and often in a lot of different areas. You also mentioned China, and there's been growing attention on China as an emerging player, as a global nuclear vendor, perhaps to eventually compete with Russia's current dominance or position. However, while the assumption is that the trajectory of the Chinese nuclear industry is sky high, not everything is necessarily rosy domestically. There's been a leveling off of electricity demand growth, especially now with the outbreak. There are debates about liberalizing domestic electricity markets, which may ultimately hurt nuclear power in China. And yet, this may all just drive the nuclear industry, the Chinese nuclear industry, to look more outward, externally to international markets. What do you think is the net effect of all of this on China as a nuclear technology exporter?
Yeah, it's a really fundamental question as we look at the picture of the global market. I think China will remain committed to nuclear power. But you're right in the sense that, even before this, there was slowdown in terms of some of the demand, and then the increasing role of renewables. Natural gas as well, and LNG imports, gas imports from Russia, etc. I think that environmental issues have been important to this commitment. We've seen a drop in terms of new starts, and they're not going to meet their 58 gigawatt target by 2020. They're going to be about 53 from what I was reading. But they still have a major contract with Russia to build 4 VVR 1200 reactors. But I think as the Chinese economy recovers, I think the drive to export will revive as well. And that Chinese companies will seek to promote nuclear as part of the broader financing of infrastructure around the world on the Belt and Road Initiative. I think given all this experience, how receptive a country is going to be to large Chinese debt financing in the post-pandemic era is going to be perhaps questionable in some cases. We talked a lot, there was a lot of talk before, especially by the administration, about debt traps. But I think countries, so the developing countries are going to be in difficult financial position and debt position. You're always seeing that in terms of, the IMF talking about $1 trillion packages for developing countries to help them keep afloat. So the degree that they can recover in is going to be important, I think, in terms of their willingness to take on these large infrastructure projects, including nuclear. So I think I think the other thing is that it's important to recognize that China, despite this huge domestic commitment and growth, really the only actual overseas experience in supplying and constructing reactors is in Pakistan, where while on one reactor, which they call the ACPR 1000, China General Nuclear is pursuing internationally, not just in Pakistan. Oh, it was just put in operation, just recently in China for the first time. So not a lot of experience with a reactor.
Sure.
they've been pushing it in different countries, and you know that it's going into the final phase of the generic regulatory review in the UK, and they're looking at trying to build one at Bradwell or another site in UK. But they haven't, they've been not successful in Romania and so far in Argentina, where they had hoped to build new reactors. But I mean, don't count them out, right?
Yeah.
That is sort of a little bit difficult but it appears from what I can tell from the financing available, information available in terms of the policy banks, that is the Chinese Export-Import Bank and the National Development Bank, that the cost of the reactors that they're offering is below $4,000 per installed kilowatt, based on the loans that they've given, about $6.5 billion to Pakistan, I think. And then, of course, they've given loans also for the Hinkley 1 plant where they're buying in but not constructing. So that's low, compared to other options. Even the Russians are, generally over $5,000 per installed kilowatt. So they're pursuing options and pursuing new projects in Czech Republic, Bulgaria again. They're back and looking at Bulgaria, and of course have had discussions with the Saudis. So it'll be interesting to see how they do, the Chinese, against the South Korea and Russian, European, U.S. competition in some of these projects if they move ahead now. I should end by saying that China is investing a lot in SMR RD&D and may have started demonstrations of a number of designs, including the high temperature gas cool reactors. I think they're smart and they see a market in the developing world in petrochemical and some of the large industrial desalination for these high temperature gas cool reactors that can provide heat as well as power. So I wouldn't be surprised, Alan, if they commercialize these reactors in the next few years, and they may indeed beat Western suppliers in terms of first international deployments. But I don't have a perfect crystal ball.
You mentioned a bit earlier about DOE's nuclear fuel working group report, in which talks about restoring the U.S.'s competitive advantage in nuclear. The document clearly states that nuclear power is intrinsically tied to national security, and this is a drum that you, Atlantic Council, and many other organizations have pounded for years. If this recognition is the first step towards getting to where we need to go, what's the next major hurdle or realization that needs to take place to make sure that nuclear energy policy in the U.S. internationally goes in the right direction?
Right. Well, I hinted at some of my biases, I think, early in what I was saying about the mechanisms of the U.S. government. But it goes beyond that, and you're right in the sense that with the task force that we had at the Atlantic Council, with a lot of distinguished industry and government officials and NGO officials, we spent a lot of time on that issue with regards to leadership and what we need to do. Strong bipartisan congressional support. So in addition to the administration giving it higher priority, hopefully, that you'll still have strong support in Congress, even though the U.S. Nuclear Leadership Act that Murkowski sponsored was not approved in the last few months here, unfortunately. But one, I think we've got to overcome this issue of the credibility of the U.S. in terms of delivering reactors on time and budget. So we gotta finish Vogtle and make sure it works. And I think that, what I hear is Southern is moving in that direction, and and they're trying not to let this COVID problem interfere with the schedules, because tremendous costs already that are well over what and people anticipated. And costs are a key factor in terms of our competitiveness of technology. I mean, we have, and the Chinese showed that they could build AP1000 technology plants in China. Got 4 of them operating. But clearly the large upfront capital cost for the large reactors. Now that XM is back in business, hopefully they can put together some packages that might allow us to compete, at least in some of the venues, like Czech Republic, that's looking at some new units at Dukovany. Westinghouse had been involved previously in Temelin. When I was in aid, we were working with the Czech Republic, Czech, on the issues, and that was allowed. They got the bid. They got the bid for the INC for the Temelin reactors. That was sort of a grafting of the Russian BVR 1000s and the Westinghouse INC. So we'll see what happens there. We'll also see what happens with regards to Poland. Because Poland, you clearly have a country that is very concerned about security issues with regards to Russia, dependence on Russian energy, having a country that has an urgent need to reduce its dependence on coal, which accounts for 75 to 80% of total electricity. And I think that is also wary about China. So, and there was a U.S. delegation in Poland not too long ago, and they're talking about 4 to 6 units. So, so I hope that provides an opportunity in the future. So, and where XM and then we've got the issue that is hinted at in the Fuel Working Group report, but not really developed, which is related to the DFC, the New Development Finance Corporation, incorporates and expands the authorities of the former Overseas Private Investment Corporation. We'll see if they can overcome those issues in terms of having resources available from DFC to help in terms of taking a stake in some of the nuclear projects, or at least doing some of the pre-feasibility and design work, which would help, I think, in some cases, sweeten the pot. And then you've got the international liability issues that we've got, to deal with, like in India, where we've tried to complete those deals for years, and the liability issues continues to be a problem. Overall, 1, 2, 3 agreements, we considered a lot of that in terms of how to have flexible but strong 1, 2, 3 agreements, so that we don't close the door before we even get out of the chute. So that's an interesting issue. And I think then the last one I would say was we've got to step up the financing for the SMR demonstrations. And that's one of the things that the U.S. Nuclear Leadership Act tries to highlight. And I think that the advanced demonstration program that was new last year's budget, hopefully it will be supported this year. I don't know that what the budgetary outlook is going to be as a result of the trillions of dollars that we have been spending on keeping the economy afloat.
A final question on COVID-19, and understandably it's a difficult topic to avoid, and certainly a recurring issue throughout this conversation, perhaps mostly as a hindrance or an interruption on progress on various issues related to energy sector transformation, clean energy transitions, carbon mitigation. Although certainly the outbreak has reduced energy demand and has reduced carbon emissions in that way. But what do you see as the opportunities? Since we are mostly dwelling on the negative, what do you see as the opportunities to emerge from this crisis with a better, cleaner future in terms of energy globally?
Right. Well, it's interesting because a lot of people are talking about the nature of the economic recovery, and obviously nobody knows for sure when and how quickly it will recover. But we have to start right with the assumption that it will recover at some point.
Crossing our fingers.
And so I think there's a lot of people that are saying we've got to think differently about the energy sector, and that we have to think more in the way of how can we rebuild businesses and infrastructure and economies to be more climate friendly, more green, sustainable. And it was interesting listening to the head of the International Monetary Fund recently talking about her feeling that that green growth, clean energy should be a higher priority in the economic recovery strategies. I think a lot of the leaders in the EU are saying this, right, in terms of the Green Deal, making sure that in the economic recovery in the EU that they are not that they are supporting this vision. And a lot of obviously that vision relates to the net zero emissions target for 2050. As you know, the Paris conference party was moved to next year, at which time there will be an opportunity to talk about what the countries individually as well as collectively want to do with regards to the targets. And I think that we should all be hoping that we can, that will see a way out in terms of trying to have a greater focus on decarbonization and sustainable growth. It's going to be interesting in our election because obviously, climate change before the pandemic was emerging as an important issue. Let's see. Hopefully, it won't be lost in the issues related to the recovery. But clearly, there are a lot of people talking about, including President Trump, about infrastructure investments and creating jobs that way. I think that, Biden has stressed the clean energy revolution and net zero 2050 goals in his platform so far. Both candidates presumptive candidates have supported nuclear power. So I think there's a lot of uncertainties, but a lot of discussion about how you can move in a direction that recognizes the importance of climate change and how economic decisions here on the recovery can support a more aggressive approach to dealing with the problem.
Dr. Ichord, thank you so much for sharing your insights and reflections on all these various issues. In spite of all that's going on right now, very, very grateful for you taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you, Alan. We covered a lot, I think, but hopefully the listeners will be happy with the results of our conversations.
I'm sure they will.